Hi, I'm Raj Khepar, and today I'm going to be taking you through a full menu walkthrough of the EOS R8. The EOS R8 is a small and light full-frame camera in the R system range, and paired with a 51.8 like this, it is my go-to travel and walkabout setup. The camera with a battery and memory card weighs only 461 grams, so you really know it is very lightweight, but it doesn't compromise on quality and performance. It's a weather-sealed body, and you also get up to 40 frames per second in the electronic shutter mode, 24 megapixel sensor based on the R6 Mark II, so you know you're getting that low light performance. Low light focusing is down to -6.5 EV. To give you an idea, -6 EV takes the human eye about a minute and a half to adjust to. So if it went dark right now, you and I wouldn't be able to see, but the camera would. I don't think there'd be much to photograph, but you know you can still focus. Like my other menu walkthrough videos, I'm going to take you through the hardware first, so the button layout and all the physical features of the camera. And then we'll dive into the menu and we'll do both stills and some video stuff. Grab yourself a cup of tea and let's get stuck in. So let's get stuck in with the hardware. On the top of the camera first, we have a dedicated video and still switch. You'll notice that is on quite a few of our EOS R system cameras now, and probably will be going forward, as it makes it a little bit easier to switch between video and stills for those hybrid shooters. Then we have the hot shoe. The hot shoe is compatible with all your existing flashes, but it also has the new multi-function shoe pins at the very front, which is very hard to see on this camera. Those pins allow you to add new accessories like microphones that are powered and connected to the camera via those pins, so you don't need to have a wire trailing into the side of the camera. There are of course other accessories as well. Next up we have the mode dial. So we have program, shutter priority, aperture priority and manual. Then we have bulb modes, so that's if you're doing longer exposures. We have C1 and C2, so there's a custom mode, so you can set those up and save your settings. The next one is a creative mode, and then I'll show you that in the menu a bit later on. And we have a scene selection mode. The final one there, before you get to fully automatic, around there is a hybrid auto mode, and that basically shoots a little bit of video every time you take a picture. It's great if you want a little highlight reel of your day or your holiday when you're taking pictures, and then you get both video and stills very easily. The green one is automatic. Now this is the simplest mode. It overrides most of the controls, so you can't change too much, but it does mean that you're going to get a great shot nearly all of the time. The final one I haven't mentioned here is FV. So FV is a flexible priority mode, and it allows you to use any of the three variables as automatic or manual. It takes a bit of getting used to if you're not used to FV, but it can be quite useful to use in a variety of different situations. Next button over, we have the record button for recording videos, and we have the on-off switch. In the middle of the on-off switch, we have a lock setting. What this does is lock your exposure dials, and this is customizable in the menu. You can even have it stop your touchscreen from working while it's in the lock position. And this just means that when you set the camera up, you can't knock the controls and change your exposure. Up the front here, we have the manual function button, or MFN. This is a customizable button, and I'll show you what this does when we go through the menus. At the very front we have the shutter button, and we have two dials. So we have one on the top for your front finger and one on the back for your thumb. These dials are used for navigating the menu and changing your exposure settings. Now we'll do the back of the camera. Just up the top on the left we have the menu button, which is the full menu, and I'll take you through that in a little while. In the middle of the D-pad we have a Q button. The Q button is a quick menu, and most of the settings you need to adjust on a regular basis will be on that Q button. Around that we have the D-pad, that's for moving the focusing point around, or it's customizable for different things as well, and for moving around the menu. Below that we have the blue play button, that's for reviewing all of your images, so you can look back in your images and video there, and then you can choose to erase them with the bin button next to it. Above that we have the info button. Now if the camera's on, we can tap that and it will cycle through different information on the back of the screen. If you're looking through the viewfinder and you tap that, it will change the information through there, and all of that is customizable. Above that, on the right hand side, we have the AF on button, so if you're using back button focus, that will be your autofocus. And to the right of that, we have the star button, which is exposure lock. Now if you're in an automatic exposure mode, you can point the camera at a certain subject, hit the exposure lock, and then recompose, and it will keep that exposure for a certain amount of time. That is a customizable button, and I often recommend people change that to something a bit more useful because a lot of people don't use exposure lock anymore. Below that we have the focus grouping button, so as soon as we tap that it will show you the different groups, the different size of areas that you can use to focus, and it will allow you to move your focusing point as well. On the right hand side we don't have anything. On the left hand side though we do have a load of ports. So on the bottom we have a microphone and headphone port, so if you're doing video and you want to put an external microphone in there, you've got a 3.5mm jack to do so, and you've got a headphone port as well so you can monitor your audio. Above that we have the cable release socket, so that's a 2.5mm jack, and that's compatible with some of our shutter release accessories. Behind this final flap here we have the USB-C and the HDMI micro HDMI for recording out to an external recorder if you're doing some video stuff, and down below the USB-C can actually be used for multiple things. So you can use it to charge the camera if you want to, using a power delivery charger, or you can use it to transfer your images across, shoot tethered as well, so if you want to be shooting and sending images straight away to your computer, you can do that via this cable. There's a couple of clever things here though. You can actually use it as a webcam. Because this is UVC compatible, you can plug and play via USB-C and your computer should recognize it as a webcam. That way you get really high quality video for streaming. On the front of the camera we don't have too many controls. Obviously we've already gone through the shutter button. This one here is the AF illumination for helping assist your AF in very dark conditions, and then we have the lens release catch there. On the bottom of the camera we have the standard 1/4 inch thread for your tripod, and then we have a battery compartment door that houses the SD card slot and your battery. The batteries are LPE 17s, and you can use UHS 2 speed cards in this camera and it will benefit and use all of that speed. The final thing I haven't mentioned is we have a vari-angle screen, so you can bring that out and flip it around, and you can actually put it away so you can't see the screen and protect it when it's in your bag. On the viewfinder, if the viewfinder isn't looking quite as sharp as it should, you have a little adjustment here which is called your diopter adjustment, and it is worth just making sure that when you're looking through the viewfinder, look at some text in the viewfinder and then adjust that so it is sharp. That's the physical side of it. Let's go dive into the menus. Time to dive into the menus. In order for me to show you what my camera is seeing, I need to hook it up to the HDMI, so I'm using a micro HDMI to HDMI adapter, and that's going into my computer with a capture card. First off, I'm going to show you the Q screen. So on normal shooting we have, we can cycle through the information here, and on the Q button in this mode we can actually see that we have a lot of the settings that we need. So we've got the focus grouping modes here, and we can go down to the AF operation, which is Servo, one shot or AI focus. The AI focus kind of switches between one shot and Servo in a hybrid mode and sort of figures out what you need as you do it. I generally recommend either putting it in one shot or Servo, depending on the subject that you're photographing. If you're photographing moving subjects, you want this in Servo. Subject to detect, this is the recognition side of the camera. So the AF recognition, are you looking at people, animals, vehicles, or do you want the camera to just be an automatic? Automatic is great and it will figure it out for itself most of the time, but if you know the type of subject you're looking for, particularly if you're photographing animals, it's best to put it in the animal mode because it will find the subject quicker and earlier. Animals on this is birds, cats and dogs, and probably some others. And vehicles here we have, you'll notice it says spot detection info to enable or disable. Now spot detection is the driver. I don't know why he's called spot, but for some reason he is. So if you want the camera to focus on the vehicle and then find the driver in that vehicle, it's able to do that as well. The last one there is off, so it's not looking for any specific subject. You can just tap to focus on a inanimate object, for example, and it will just do that. Below this is the image quality, so we've got JPEGs, or we can hit the info to change from RAW or turn RAW off. And And then below that we have drive mode. So if we want to go across to high-speed continuous, we can. That's high-speed continuous plus. It's when you're in electronic shutter mode, it's going really, really fast. High speed is high speed for electronic and for your mechanical shutter. And in electronic first curtain, you're getting 6 frames per second max. Then we've got a low speed continuous, a self timer for 10 seconds, a self timer for 2 seconds, and a custom mode. So at the end of the self timer, it will take a certain number of shots. This is quite useful if you don't know that you're going to get the exact shot at the end of your self timer. You can actually let the camera do a few. And we have single shooting as well. Metering mode at the bottom, so if you're shooting in a automatic mode like aperture priority, TV priority, or program, or even manual with the ISO and automatic, it's worth knowing that your metering mode will be affected by this. So this is how the camera decides what the exposure is. So we can go for evaluative, which takes into account the whole frame, a partial metering, spot metering, which is the very center, and then center weighted average as well. The back button just gets rid of this menu. Below that is anti-flicker shoot. So if you're indoors like I am now and we have lighting that is flickering, which nearly all lighting does, you can turn that on and the camera will automatically detect that flicker, and that wave of light, it'll basically pick out the highlight, the high points, so you're getting consistent lighting between each shot. Below that is white balance. You can set your white balance to any of these modes. Auto white balance, you'll notice here we've got auto white balance or auto white balance W. If I press info, oops, not info, this button here. The top right button, the focus grouping mode button, we can switch between auto white balance white or ambient priority. Now ambient priority in here will take into account some of this yellow light that I've got. And that's because it does look yellow to our eyes, so we want it to look a little bit more natural. Or if we go white priority, it will make all the whites actually white. And then we have different and then we have the different standard presets for white balance. And we have a custom mode, so we can actually shoot an image and set a custom white balance based on the environment we're in. Or what I personally do is set the color temperature using a Kelvin value. So we can go in here and set the Kelvin value just using a scroll wheel, making it cooler or brighter. Next one down is picture style. So picture styles won't affect your image in RAW if you're bringing it into something like Lightroom or Photoshop. If you bring it into DPP, it will show you the picture style that you're using. But this mostly affects the JPEG. So the preview that you see on the back of the screen is a JPEG, even if you're shooting in RAW. So it will apply a picture style to it. When you bring it into your computer, it then disregards that information because it's in RAW. With JPEGs, it's embedded that information. So if you're shooting in JPEG mode, the picture style will affect it. And picture styles are quite useful. So you can have portrait mode, which kind of makes the skin a little bit more flattering, or we've got landscape, fine detail, neutral and faithful. We can go to black and white modes, and you can actually set up your own custom ones as well. So I tend to have mine in neutral or faithful, and the reason for that is I want it to be as close to the raw image as possible. What can happen is you'll look at the back of the screen and think that looks great, really punchy, and you bring it into the computer and it reads that raw differently, and then it doesn't look quite the same. So I like to have it on neutral or faithful to give you the closest image on the back of the screen to what it would be on my computer. Below that we have creative filters, so we can go in here and put a grainy black and white filter, soft focus, fisheye, all sorts. Worth having a play with that. Below that we have cropping or aspect ratio, so we have the full usage of the sensor on the full mode. We can go into 1.6 crop mode, which is quite useful if you're using APS-C or crop lenses. We have a 1:1 aspect ratio, 4:3 or 16:9. Now, if you are shooting in RAW, what it'll do is give you a little box in the frame when you play back your images on the camera, because that's where you're cropping into, your aspect ratio is set to, but it will give you the whole image. While we're here, I'm going to show you one other thing with the Q menu. So if I hit info, I can cycle through to this screen. This screen gives me a few more options, but a lot of the same settings are here as well. So a few different ones. You get flash exposure compensation. Now this allows you to change the brightness or the darkness of the flash relative to your exposure. If you have a flash on the camera. It also allows you quicker access to the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth connection. And we also have lighting optimizer, auto lighting optimizer, which basically allows the camera to take into account the light on the person's face and prioritize their face. Oops. And we also have white balance shift. Oops. So we can go in and just shift the colors in the white balance. I don't tend to do this. You can do this in RAW afterwards on Photoshop and whatever. The final thing that you have quicker access to from here is the custom control menu. So I can hit Q and go right across to this, which is customize controls. And in here, there is loads of options for customizing your button layout and your dials. I'm going to go into this a bit later when we find it in the full menu, but it's just good to know that there's a quick shortcut to it from the Q screen. Okay, let's get started with the full menu. We're going to hit menu and we come up with this, which is the red menu 1. Now, before we get started, I'm going to just show you a quick thing. When you're in the menu on this camera, you can actually tap the info button and it will take you through the different tabs. So you don't have to scroll through every page to get to a new tab. It does make navigating the menu a little bit quicker. Red menu 1. Image quality, we've gone through that on the Q screen, but this allows you to change between JPEG and RAW. You'll notice it says JPEG or HEIF, and HEIF is a mode, is a image format which gives you a little bit more information and a smaller file to JPEG, and we can change to HEIF by changing another setting somewhere else in the menu, which I'll show you. The next one is dual pixel RAW. Now this is different to dual pixel AF, but it uses the same technology. Dual pixel AF basically works by splitting the pixel into two. Dual pixel RAW gives you the information from both of those sides. Now, using that doesn't give you double the resolution, but what it does do is allow you a little bit more flexibility for editing if you bring the image into DPP, which is Canon's free RAW editing software. And it allows you to adjust things like the point of optimal sharpness, reducing ghosting and flare, and a few other cool things. It's not something you need to have on all the time, but it is worth experimenting with because you can get a bit more out of your sensor by using it. Next one is cropping and aspect ratio. This allows you to go into 1.6 crop mode for using APS-C lenses, and we went through this on the Q screen. The next one is digital teleconverter. We can put that on 2 or 4 times. I don't tend to use this, and when you're shooting in RAW, it's disabled anyway. You can't use it. So I'm going to put that back into RAW mode. In the red menu 2, we have exposure compensation or auto exposure bracketing. That's what AEB stands for, auto exposure bracketing. Then we go into this menu, we can use the top dial to use exposure bracketing, or we can just press left and right to make the image brighter or darker. Now, if you're just making it brighter or darker, there are quicker ways to get to this. If you use the Q button on the shooting screen, you can actually get to this much faster. But for exposure bracketing, this is quite a nice way of getting to it. Below that, ISO speed settings, we can actually limit the ISO, so we can change the ISO here, but we can change the range. So if you don't want it to go too high, you can actually limit that. You can also set your minimum shutter speed to slightly faster in an automatic mode if you know that you're not getting images quite as sharp because you're getting handshake in there. It's not an exact science, so some people will get hand movement in sooner than others. The next one is HDR shooting, so HDR PQ. If I turn this on, shots will be captured in HEIF format rather than JPEG if you're using JPEG. Now HDR basically gives you an increased dynamic range. It's high dynamic range shooting. This is something that's come over from the video world, and it gives you really punchy images. The one below this is HDR. The one below this is a different type of HDR. So this is about taking multiple images and combining them to give you more dynamic range. And it will do this internally in the camera. And we can go in here. So we can go in here, click this, and we can set to moving subject for photographing a moving subject. And this gives you less control. And then the one below that is dynamic range. So this one gives you a lot more control, and you can decide how those images are combined, but also whether it saves all of the individual images as well as the finished image. You'll also notice down there we have auto align. So if you're doing this handheld, you can actually let the camera align those images because they'll all be slightly off otherwise. I'm going to turn that off so we can do some of the other menus. Below that is auto lighting optimizer. I showed you this in the Q screen, but this allows you to set the camera in the automatic modes to take into account the face. So it will actually make sure the light on the face is better. So below that is highlight tone priority. Now this basically allows you to try and keep the highlight, the bright areas like this area here in my screen, to keep some of that tonal range in there so it doesn't blow out too much. In red menu 3, camera menu 3, so we have anti-flicker shoot, as I mentioned before, and this basically takes into account the flicker of the light, so the lights are kind of doing this wave, and it takes the picture at the top every single time. Now this will slow down your burst mode, but it will make sure that the lighting is consistent, and this is particularly useful when you're shooting in an indoor environment. Below that we have high frequency anti-flicker shooting. Now this is a very useful thing. We need to be in manual for it. And I'm going to go back into the menu, high frequency anti-flicker shooting. We can turn that on and then we can go down to auto detect. Now we have the flicker detection, that will be fine for an environment like we're in now, but often with some of the newer LED lights, they're flickering at a much higher frequency. So we can actually go in and auto detect, and I'm going to press OK, and it's going to cycle through different shutter speeds to find the flicker. And you'll notice there it's found a flicker of 499.3 Hertz. Because I have some pretty unusual LEDs apparently, or I have lots of different LEDs in this room. And then it'll change the shutter speed to something that's suitable for that, to eliminate that flicker. There we are. And then you'll notice that I can actually fine tune that and set my shutter speed to something very unusual, which is something you can't do on a digital SLR. I'm going to turn that back off. And there we go. Below that is external speedlight control. If you have an external speedlight attached to your camera, this allows you to change the settings of that speedlight rather than use it on the menu on the back of the flash. It won't allow me in there. Oh, it will. There's a few things here that's quite useful. So ETTL metering, ETTL2 metering, we can actually set a face priority. Again, it's recognizing where the face is and making sure the light is prioritized for the subject. A load of the other settings here it won't allow me to do because the flash isn't connected. But basically allows you to set up the flashes the way you want here. Metering mode, we went through that on the Q screen, so I'm not going to go back in through that. Red menu 4, so we've got white balance. I did go through this on the Q screen, but you have all the different modes here, and we can set Kelvin value. Custom white balance, we can go in here and actually pick an image from our memory card and set a custom white balance based on that. Useful if you've got a grey card or something like that. And white balance shift, I showed you that a little while ago, but we can actually adjust this, fine tune our white balance here. Again, I don't tend to do this because I use it in RAW. Color space, sRGB or Adobe RGB. Now if you're shooting in RAW, it doesn't really matter what you're working with here because you're getting all of the information from the camera. What I would say is if you're using your images mostly on the internet, I would work in sRGB. The reason for that is the internet works in sRGB. So if you shoot in RGB, in Adobe RGB and edit your images in Adobe RGB, you're working on a bigger color space. So there's more colors in Adobe RGB. But then you're going to export it and put it on the internet where you're leaving it up to different browsers to interpret that information and bring it down to sRGB. So you're going to get different results depending on what browser people are using and what computer people are using. So I tend to recommend that people use sRGB for most things. If you're doing lots of print though, Adobe RGB does give you that extra color space and is well worth it for maximizing the colors in your images. But again, because you're shooting in RAW, you can change that over in your RAW editor. You don't necessarily need to do it in camera here. Below that is picture style. So we have faithful, and all of these. I've mentioned that on the Q screen, and it just changes the JPEG preview or embeds it into the JPEG images that you're using. Below that is clarity. We can actually set our clarity in the images. Now this isn't going to be it's going to be disregarded in RAW if you bring it into something like Lightroom or Photoshop, but it just increases the micro contrast, particularly useful for your JPEGs. Below that is shooting creative filters. I did show you this on the Q screen, but it allows you to fine tune the effect so you can actually make it smaller, sorry, less or more prominent. I'm going to turn that off. And then we go across to red menu 5. Lens aberration correction. Now this is an area that is particularly useful on the R system range because it's well worth having a look here. It's well worth having digital lens optimizer on and your peripheral illumination correction on. Sometimes you'll want the distortion correction on, it depends on what lens you're using and what you're shooting, but digital lens optimizer will do most of this stuff for you anyway. And the benefit of the R system is that the lens correction data is stored inside the lens, so you're getting that information directly from the lens. You know that's going to optimize it and give you the sharpest and best image possible. Below that we have long exposure noise reduction, so when you're doing long exposures, the sensor can warm up and you can build up noise in the images, so this will just try and reduce that. And then high ISO speed noise reduction, so obviously as you push up your ISO you're going to get sort of higher levels of noise. This will reduce that. Now again, this is applies to your JPEGs. The dust delete data, you can actually obtain data for removing dust specks on the sensor from your images. It's well worth having a look in the menu, in the full manual for this, because it's a little bit more in depth. Shooting menu 6, multiple exposures. Now this is about taking different pictures and layering them on. If we enable that, we can change the way that the camera kind of blends those images and how many images it does. Below that is continual multiple exposure, so we can have it do it repeatedly or just for one end result picture. You can actually start with an image you have already taken, so you can go down here and select image for multiple exposure, pick one from your card, and it'll overlay that inside the viewfinder of what you're looking at, and then you can sort of compose and take a new picture. I'm going to disable that so I can show you the next one. Below that we have raw burst mode. Now this is quite an interesting feature and it's really great for wildlife. Now if you imagine you're photographing a bird and it's about to leave a perch and you're waiting for that to happen and it leaves, by the time you hit the shutter button you've already missed the shot. So raw burst mode, if we enable that and enable pre-shooting, what it will do is allow us to spool images. So once we half press the shutter button, you'll see on the left hand side it started to spool images and that bar is creeping up a little bit. And that's your buffer. Now, as soon as I hit the shutter button, and I'm going to hold the shutter button down to take some pictures, it will save half a second of images preceding me hitting that button. So you're kind of going back in time and taking pictures. So as soon as I start taking pictures, you'll see that buffer start to creep up, and then it's filled up, and I'm kind of waiting for it to write to those images to the memory card, but it has saved that half a second preceding, so I can't miss the shot. I'm going to disable that. Oops. It's worth noting for features like this, because you're generating a lot of data very quickly, it's worth having the fastest memory cards you can get to clear that buffer as fast as possible. Below that is focus bracketing. Now focus bracketing is pretty much for macro. It has some other uses as well, but what it does is allow the camera to take a picture at a certain focus distance and then focus a little bit further away, take another picture, and focus a little bit further away and take another picture. And what it does is give you much more depth of field, because with macro work, your depth of field tends to be very, very, very shallow. So if you imagine you're photographing an insect and you're only getting the antenna in and not the rest of the body, that would be quite frustrating. So what this does is allow you to take lots of pictures of all the way through the body of the animal and then, or the subject, and the camera will then combine those images afterwards. You can also have the camera save all of the individual images and you can combine them afterwards. I tend to do that because it allows me more flexibility for deciding how much of that subject I want in focus. The next one is drive mode. So shooting menu 7, drive mode. We've gone through that on the quick screen. Interval timer. This allows you to set the camera to take a picture at certain set intervals. So you can say 10 shots every 10 seconds as it's set to now. But if we go in here and say info detail set, we can actually set up what the interval is and how many pictures to take over that time period. I'm going to press menu and disable that. Below that is bulb timer. So bulb timer, we do need to be in manual mode, in bulb mode. So we're going to go over to bulb mode and then hit bulb timer. So bulb timer basically allows you to take a picture for as long as you want. So you can set the exposure above that 30-second limit that you normally get in manual, which is quite handy. I'm going to go back to manual now and show you the next one, silent shutter function. So this goes into a fully silent mode. The camera doesn't make any noise at all, and it removes all those beeps that you get when you're sort of focusing, or the fake shutter noise when it takes a picture in electronic shutter mode. Below that we have shutter mode, so we have electronic first curtain or electronic. Now electronic first curtain is quite similar to mechanical, so it uses a mechanical second curtain, and this is great for shooting things that are very fast moving across your frame, because in electronic you can get a little bit of distortion. Now this is called rolling shutter. Electronic mode can't be used with flash photography, so you need to be in electronic first curtain if you're using a flash. Below this we have release shutter without card. We can enable or disable this. I tend to recommend that we disable this on most people's cameras, because then you know you cannot take a picture without your memory card, because what's the point in that anyway? And you don't want to be going to a shoot and taking a few images and then realizing you didn't even put a memory card in there. It does give you a big warning across the top of the screen, but it's remarkably easy to ignore that. Take it from experience. Red menu 8, IS stabilizer mode. We can go in and turn on digital IS. Now this is for video, not for stills, but it basically crop into the image very so slightly and allow you to have a sort of stabilization in your video. You can customize your quick controls layout here. I'm not going to go massively into that, but if you don't use some of those settings and you want others in there, you can do that there. Below that we have a touch shutter, so we can enable that, and when you're looking at the image on the back screen you can tap the screen and it will take a picture. You don't actually have to hit the shutter button. I tend to disable that because sometimes I knock the screen when I'm sort of walking around and it takes pictures. Below that is image review. So when you take a picture and it pops up on the back screen, how long does it stay there for? And you can decide whether or not that pops up into the viewfinder or not. By default it's off, so it only comes up on the back screen. So essentially if you're looking through the viewfinder and you bring it away, then it will show you the picture. Below that is high-speed display. Now this will only work when you're in a drive mode that allows it, so you need to be in high-speed continuous. And essentially speeds up the viewfinder, so it keeps it at a higher free refresh rate. And that's great for shooting moving subjects and things like that. It keeps up with it a little bit easier. So below that is the metering timer. So this is when the camera has metered for an image, how long it holds that metering for. Particularly if you hold the exposure lock button. It'll hold it for 8 seconds. So red menu 9, display simulation. Now this one is about, is quite a useful thing to know. So when you change your exposure on a mirrorless camera, what you see is what you get. As you make it brighter, it gets brighter on the screen, and you know that's what you're going to come out with a picture. If you don't want that, or you're working with flashes that the camera doesn't necessarily recognize, often the image is quite dark because you're exposing for a flash that's going to be very bright that the camera can't see. So turning this off can be quite a useful thing to do. Below that is OVF Simulation View Assist. Now this will use the viewfinder and make it look more like a digital SLR. So if you want it to feel a little bit more like a DSLR, you can actually go in here and enable that. And it uses that sort of extra dynamic range and makes the colors look a little bit more natural. And but then what you see isn't what you get. So your exposure won't be what you get on, it behaves exactly the same as a digital SLR then. Below that is shooting info display. We can actually toggle the information that we see on the screen, both in the viewfinder and on the screen. So we can choose whether or not to have any of these and then customize those as well. We can go down and say grid. We might want a grid to help with composition. That's also useful. Change the text when you go into portrait mode so that you actually still read it in when you go into vertical. And you can even change your histogram from a brightness 1 to an RGB, so it's split into 3. I'll just show you what that looks like. There you go, so you've got all 3 channels. Below that is viewfinder display format. You can have it slightly cropped in. Display performance, we can go power saving or smooth. Now, power saving obviously saves you a little bit more of your battery life. Smooth gives you a much smoother look through the viewfinder, quite useful for moving subjects. Camera menu 10. So this is for video stuff, movie recording size. We've got 4K at 50 frames per second, 4K at 25, Full HD at 50 and Full HD at 25. Below this we have sound recording. Oh, sorry. So the difference between 50 and 25, you view your footage back at 25 frames per second generally, so you can actually go to half speed if you go to 50 frames per second. Sound recording, this allows you to change your levels, so whether it's too loud or too quiet. I tend to leave this on automatic for most things. Below is ISO speed settings for video, so you can set up your maximum automatic ISO. And then below that is your auto slow shutter. So it automatically records brighter movies when dark, or records movies with a smooth subject moving when dark. So you're kind of, whether your camera allows it to go to a slower shutter speed or it keeps that shutter speed higher and then compensates using ISO. So below that is shutter button function for movies. You can actually customize what the shutter button does when you're shooting video, when you're in video mode. I tend to leave that as it is. Right, so AF menu 1. We'll go to the pink AF menu now. AF operation, we've gone through that on the cue screen. We've got one shot, AI focus or servo. I tend to leave mine on servo for most things, primarily because I use back button focus, but we'll get into that later. AF area, we've got a spot AF or slightly larger expanded areas, and you can do the tracking in any of these modes. The flexible zone AF modes, you can actually make that zone bigger or smaller as well. Below that we have whole area tracking servo AF. We can basically allow the camera to track a subject across the entire area or not. Below that is subject to detect. We've gone through that on the cue screen, but we have automatic people, animals and vehicles, and then spot detection is for the driver or rider of that vehicle. And put them on people. Eye detection is on automatic, or we can disable it, or we can have a preference for the subject's right or left eye if we want. I tend to leave that on auto. Below that we have switching tracked subjects. This is quite a useful one as well. So if you pick your subject in the frame and you want the camera to stick to that person only and not switch between them, you might want that on initial priority. But if the subject turns around and you're happy for the camera to pick someone else instead, you can have this on slightly higher, 1 or 2. I'd have it on slightly higher if you're photographing a sort of more of a larger group of birds that are moving slightly more erratically. But if you're photographing a wedding, for example, and you want your bride to be in focus and only the bride, I'd have it on lower. Focus mode down here, we have autofocus or manual focus. A lot of the lenses have a switch for this, so that will override the setting here. Or this will override that setting. The AF menu 2, we have cases. Now this is about how the focusing system behaves once it's found a subject and is tracking that subject. It doesn't change the initial pickup speed of the finding the subject, but then it's just about how it behaves when it's moving around with that subject across the frame. So the two variables that you'll see are tracking sensitivity and acceleration deceleration tracking. It's basically about whether that subject is going to be moving erratically, directly towards you, or going across and you're panning with it. So if we have a subject coming directly towards us, tracking sensitivity wants to be on slightly higher. Tracking sensitivity basically allows us to tell the camera that if we're panning with a subject and something becomes between us and the subject, like a tree branch or a lamppost, we don't want the camera to switch to the tree branch and then try and get back to the subject. We want it to give it a little bit of a delay. So we want it to go, sees a tree branch, sees that change of distance and says, well, maybe you're not wanting that, I'll wait. But if the subject is coming directly towards you, that's a constant change of distance. So you want that tracking sensitivity on a bit higher. The acceleration deceleration tracking is about whether the subject is going to suddenly start moving or stopping in the frame, and that sets the camera up ready to sort of react to that behavior. Now I recommend that you pick a subject here. Now I really recommend that you pick a case here that fits the subject that you're photographing. Automatic does a great job, but if you're really pushing the camera with faster moving subjects, it's worth picking one that is relevant to that subject and the behavior of it. AF menu 3, one-shot AF release priority. Do you want it ready to take a picture quicker, even if it's not quite in focus, or prioritize focus over taking a picture quickly? For me, what's the point of the picture if it's not in focus? Now we have preview AF. Now this is something that used to be called continuous AF in some of the older cameras. So it's just aware that this is exactly the same setting with a different name. Preview AF is when the camera is idling, whether it's constantly trying to find focus or not. I have this on disable. Below this is lens drive when AF is impossible. If the camera can't focus on anything, can't find anything, does it continue trying or not? Below that is AF assist beam firing. So this little light here on the top of the camera is a little LED light, and when it's very, very dark and the camera's struggling to focus, it will fire a little light beam to help it focus. AF menu 4, touch and drag AF settings. Now this is something that is quite useful on this camera because we don't have a little joystick to move the focusing point, which I kind of miss from an R5 or an R6 Mark II. But what we can do is actually set the touchscreen to be our joystick. So if we go in here, enable this, and then we position method on relative, not absolute, it means that it's just easier to use this way. You're gonna have to trust me on that one. Active touch area, right, for me, because I'm a right eye shooter, so the space I want is on this side of the screen and it's closer to my thumb. And we can adjust the sensitivity of that. Now this only affects the focusing system when the camera is right up to my eye and we're using the viewfinder. I can't show you this because I've got it hooked up to this, so the viewfinder is deactivated. But basically when you bring it up to your eye, you can drag your thumb across the touch screen and it will move the focusing point for you. I'm going to disable that now. We can limit the AF areas. If you don't use some of these, you can remove some. Make it easier to switch between them. Orientation linked AF point. Now this is down to whether when you're in portrait or vertical, you can actually have a different focusing point sort of ready to go. For most people, I don't recommend having this on, but I do recommend playing with it to see if you like it. Below this is limit subject to detect. So we can remove animals or cars if you don't use those. And then below that, left or right eye detection, you can limit those as well. I probably would limit those because there's not an opportunity where I'd want to prefer left or right. I'd want it on auto. The next one is manual focus peaking. So when we're in manual focus mode, and as you're focusing the camera, it'll give you an outline around your subject. You can go in and enable this and change the color so it's a little bit more obvious depending on the subject matter. And whatever's got that outline is in focus. Below this is focus guide. This is particularly useful, and I think it's more accurate than focus peaking. And I'll just show you what that looks like. So if I go to MF, I'm going to focus on my drink here. And I'm in focus. And it will show you if you're front or back focusing, which is really useful. And it's really easy to absolutely confirm that you are in focus. Below that is movie servo AF. So this is when you're in movie mode. Is it continually focusing or not? And generally you want it to be, because you want it to be tracking those faces. Okay, so AF menu 6, you have electronic full-time manual focus. This allows you to override the autofocus with a manual, by manually focusing the lens if you have an electronic manual focus ring. Below that is lens electronic manual focus. This basically allows you to customize what that ring does when you're using it in manual, when you're using it while your camera is set to autofocus mode. Below that is focus ring rotation. You can actually switch the rotation for your focus ring because it's electronic. The next one is RF lens manual focus ring sensitivity. So you can actually change the throw. Because it's an electronic focus ring, you can have it a small turn does a lot or a small turn does very little. Blue menu. So the blue menu is playback menu. So we have protect images. You can go in and select images to protect. It adds a little lock symbol to them. You can go and erase images. And you can actually erase whole groups of images or whole folders of images as well. You can rotate specific stills in there. You can change the movie rotation information. So if you shot in portrait and you didn't tell the camera that you were going to do that, you can change the rotation information so that it brings it onto the computer as a portrait video. We can go and set ratings for images as well, or videos. And that can help for when you bring it into the computer, you can actually see those rated images and find them much quicker. I tend to do this sort of stuff on the computer anyway. It's a bit easier. Using a web service, you can actually set up a print order and photobook setup. It's worth having a look online for this if you're interested in this specifically. Again, I tend to do this on the computer. Playback menu 2, raw image processing. So if you want to process some of your RAWs down to JPEG, you can actually do that in camera and convert them. You can apply some of those filters onto images you've already taken using the Creative Assist here. And then quick control raw processing. You can set what the raw processing parameters are when you are in playback and you hit the Q button, the quick menu. Cloud raw imaging processing. So this allows you to use the cloud-based service to get even more image quality out of your raw images. But you do have to set up a subscription service and a web service for this. And it sort of sends it through your mobile phone or your web connection to our cloud service for image processing. Playback creative filters. You can, again, apply these sort of fun filters to them. So below that you can resize and crop your images. And this is useful if you're in the field and you need to send images quickly. You can sort of edit them, crop them, resize them, send it over to your mobile phone and send it on to your client or to the internet or, social media. If you have been shooting in HEIF and you have a compatibility thing and you need to send JPEG images, you can actually convert your HEIF images to JPEG in camera, which is quite useful in camera menu 3. Below that we have a slideshow. We can set up a slideshow so it can go out via the HDMI cable to a screen. You can even show HDR images through the HDMI cable as well if you have a compatible screen. Set image search conditions so you can find images based on different parameters, whether you've rated it a certain star number or it's a different folder or a different date. When you hit the playback, what does it show you? Does it show you the last scene or does it show you the last image taken every single time? And generally I leave it on default. Magnification, this is very useful. I really recommend that you go in here and set to actual size from focus point. And the reason for that is when you go to check your images and you magnify in, you really want to see that it is in focus. You want to double check that it's in focus. So at the moment you go and press magnify, it goes to 2 times, and you're kind of having to scroll in and zoom in a bit more. And that it takes up time that you don't need to use. What this does is go to 100% at the point where it says it's in focus, and then you can double check and make sure that that is definitely in focus. Much quicker. Image jump when you're using the top scroll wheel. So when you're in playback and you press left and right, it will go for 1 image, but on the top scroll wheel you can set it to go for a certain number of images, or 1 image, or by certain dates as well. So you can sort of cycle through groups much quicker. Playback menu 4, playback information display. How much of these different groups that you can see. If you don't use any of them, some of them you can get rid of it. Below is highlight alert. When you enable this, when you play back an image, when something is over 90% white, like this area is probably going to be pretty close to blown out, it will flash at you. It will flash black and white. And that enables you to very quickly see that you're close to or you are overexposing your image. AF point display will show you red dots where the AF point was. And playback grid is sort of an overlay to help with composition. Movie play count is to whether you're using timecode or the recording time of that. Timecode is when you're using multiple cameras at once. I'd leave it on record time for most people. And for the HDMI, you can set the HDMI to HDR output, like I mentioned for the sort of slideshows and things like that. You can actually allow it to do HDR output. To the purple connection menu. So we have the ability to connect to a smartphone, a wireless remote Bluetooth sort of remote trigger. We can connect to EOS utility via a laptop or a computer, and that allows you to shoot tethered wirelessly. Or we can upload to image.canon, which is a cloud storage system. We can also go and set up an advanced connection, but these are sort of wizards that help you go through and connect to these different things. I'm not going to go through the connection process for each of these, but I will just show you the basic setup for connecting to a smartphone. All we need to do is add a device to connect to. I'm going to end that connection to my current phone, and we just set the camera to go. On the phone, we then open up the app and we look for this particular camera. And the camera will find that because it's trying to connect via Bluetooth. It then, once it's connected via Bluetooth, will then enable it to sort of change over to Wi-Fi, and you can control the camera remotely and see the images that are on the memory card. It's very useful. It's really as simple as that. You can, you'll notice here, send it to smartphone after every shot. If you wanted to, you can have the camera send an image every single time it takes a picture. This will, of course, drain your battery a little bit, and it won't necessarily keep up with the camera, the amount of data that you're producing if you're shooting in burst mode. In the connection menu 2, we have aeroplane mode. We can enable that or disable that. That just completely kills all connections. Wi-Fi settings, we can go and actually set up a dedicated... In Wi-Fi settings, we can enable or disable the Wi-Fi or set our MAC address. Bluetooth settings, we can enable or disable the Bluetooth and see what we're connected to. Below that, we can set our camera name. So if you want to customize your camera name, you can do that there. And you can set up GPS device settings. So if you have the camera, the optional accessory for a GPS device to sit on the top of the camera, you can do that there. You can actually set the GPS to send via the app as well. So if you've got the connection to the app, you can do that. If you are getting a connection error, all the details should be in this little bit here. And then the one below this is reset communication settings, which is a useful thing to have because every now and again, if you can't find what you've done and it's not quite working and you've got a setting slightly wrong, just reset it here. It'll make it a little bit easier to find and start again because it's quite easy to set up from the beginning. Yellow menu. So this is the spanner menu. This holds some of the sort of camera settings. We can set up our folder, so we can make new folders and rename those folders. So if you're doing different areas or different days, you can actually set up new folders. I'm a big fan of using folders within a memory card. File numbering to go to continuous or to reset every single time that you put a new card in there. I tend to go for continuous because you might change card multiple times during a day and you end up with the same numbers and it can cause a clash when you bring it on the computer. Below that is an ability to format card, whether your images auto-rotate on the camera or just on the computer when you're sort of playing them back. Below that is video rotation information. I tend to have this on enable because more and more we're shooting content for online social media platforms and we tend to shoot in portrait, and that will then allow the computer to see that as a portrait video straight away. We can set the date time below that and our language below that. Yellow menu 2, we have video system, so PAL or NTSC. So if you're in the US, you go to NTSC. For most online stuff, it doesn't really matter which one you're in, but within Europe, we are in PAL. So that's 25 frames per second rather than 30 frames per second in video mode, basically. Help text size, we can set our help text to slightly larger if it makes it a little bit easier for you to see. We can have our mode guide, so when we change mode it gives you a little bit of information about what that mode does and what it means. And we have a feature guide there as well, so similar thing, when you're going through features it'll show you what they are and give you a little bit brief explanation of things. It kind of comes up with a pop-up. Beep, so when you're changing settings or you're when you're focusing and you're on one shot, it comes up with a little beep to confirm your focus. You might not like that, you can disable that. And for certain other things, controls, it will sometimes beep as well. I tend to disable that. You can also adjust the volume there and adjust the volume of your headphones too. Yellow menu 3, power saving settings. I have changed this because I want the camera to not turn off while I'm doing this video. But generally this will be on screen dimmer on like 5 seconds or something, so it reduces the brightness of the screen when you're not doing too much, and it will turn the screen off after a certain amount of time. Likewise with power off, that doesn't tend to be on 5 minutes, it tends to be on 1 minute or something, or 30 seconds or something like that. And it just means that the camera's preserving power when you're not doing too much. Screen viewfinder display, so this is whether it how it switches between using the viewfinder or the back screen. Auto 1 will basically switch between the two when the screen's like this, but as soon as you bring it out, it will not switch between the two because it assumes you're doing video and you're going from low down or high up with the screen out like this. Or you can fix it to viewfinder or screen. You can actually set up a custom control to switch between the two as well if you wanted to do it manually. Screen brightness, it's fairly self-explanatory, and then the viewfinder brightness as well, that can be customized. You can actually fine-tune your viewfinder color tone in here, so if you find that it's slightly different to the back screen, you can fine-tune that. And then below that, user interface magnification, so if you're finding it difficult to see what things say, you can enable this, and then you just double tap the screen and it will magnify into certain elements so that you can actually read it a little bit easier. You don't need to double tap with 2 fingers. HDMI resolution, so when you're doing the HDMI out, what is the resolution of that? It can be automatic or 1080p, and you force 1080p. Yellow menu 4. Touch control, we can have it on standard, sensitive, or disable it. If you don't like using touchscreens at all, you can disable it. And some people have fingers that don't quite activate touchscreens, or you're wearing gloves, you can have it on sensitive. Multifunction lock, so this is the lock switch on between the on and the off on the on-off switch, and that's what it locks. I did mention earlier you can customize that. So sensor cleaning, this is about the when you turn the camera off, it will say sensor cleaning on the back screen, and it's basically using an ultrasonic vibration of the sensor to knock off any dust. Below you have USB connection app, so if you're using the USB connection, you can use it to import photos or use a remote control via a EOS utility on a PC or using the Android app. Below with that we have video calls and streaming, so if you're using it for a webcam you can set it to that on this, or you can set it to Canon apps for iPhone, which is a dedicated iPhone certification via the USB-C. Camera menu 5, so we have reset camera. We can go in and set individual settings, so the basic settings, or each area of stuff that you can reset is listed here. So resetting basic settings doesn't reset everything, just so you know that. If you can't find what setting you've changed and you've done something and the camera's not operating correctly, go in there and just reset the area you think it is, because it will probably be something that needs resetting. And then you can just go and change the settings again. So if you find you've done something wrong, don't panic. You can just reset it. If you set the camera up the way you want for a shooting mode, you can then save it to custom 1 or 2. And then you can register those settings here. Auto update set, so when you turn the camera off and turn it back on, it'll go reset to whatever you had custom 1 saved to. Or if you have auto update set, if you're in custom one and you change the settings, it will then resave it every single time. Battery information, it will actually tell you the performance of your battery, which is currently very good. You can set your copyright information here and it will save that to the metadata of your images. So when you shoot your images and you bring it onto the computer, you can actually see your name in the metadata, and it just helps for copyright information. Below that is manual software URL, so if you need to find the actual full manual, you can use your phone to scan this QR code and it will take you to the manual. Certification logo display, this is just something we have to have in the camera, don't worry too much about that. And then below that is firmware. It'll tell you what firmware your lens and your camera is on. And if you need to update it, you can put a memory card in with a new firmware and go here and it'll give you the option to update it. Currently, at the time of this video going out, there is no firmware for the R8. We are currently on version 1. You can also update firmware, by the way, using the EOS app, so the Camera Connect app. You can actually update the firmware using that. Okay, now we're on to the orange menu. So we have exposure level increments, ISO speed increments. This is down to how big the increment is. It's a half stop or 1/3 of a stop. Speed for metering ISO auto. So this is to do with when you're in a mode with an automatic ISO. Does the camera retain that or the ISO setting that it picked after the metering timer ends or not? I don't know why you would change this too much, but it might work for you. Bracketing auto cancel, so this is if you do set your camera up to the auto exposure bracketing that I mentioned earlier, does it cancel after you've taken those 3 images or 5 images, depending on how many you do. The bracketing sequence, this is the order of those, so whether it's the image at correct exposure and then below and then above as it is currently, or which order you want that in. The number of bracketing shots, you can have 3, 2, 5 or 7. Safety shift is when you're in shutter priority or aperture priority. It basically allows the camera to shift and override your exposure to make sure that you get an image at roughly the correct exposure. Custom menu 2, same exposure for new aperture. Now this is quite useful if you're changing lenses or you're using a lens with a variable aperture in the zoom. You can have this enabled, so it either uses the ISO or the shutter speed or both to change the exposure to maintain the same exposure as your aperture changes. And this is for manual mode. Also exposure lock metering mode after focus. So when you half press the shutter button and the camera is focusing, which of these modes locks that exposure? Set shutter speed range. You'll notice here that I've got an asterisk here because I've changed mine. Within these you can set limit your range of shutter speeds. And then below that we have the aperture range. You can also limit your aperture range as well if you wanted to. Custom mode 3, you can change the direction of your dials to set your aperture or shutter speed. So these dials on the top, you can actually change the direction whether it goes plus or minus in each direction. Below that is the ring on the lens, so that's when you're using the ring as a control ring, which direction that goes plus and minus. Then we have switch the control rings when shooting. This switches functions assigned to the main dial and quick control dial by customized dials. I actually don't know what that does. I'm going to look into that. Next we have one of my favorite areas of the camera, which is the customize button and customize dials menu. So customize buttons, we can go in and change what the buttons do and how the camera functions. And I really recommend that you spend some time having a look in here because there's a lot these cameras can do and they're set up to kind of be the best for everybody. But that doesn't mean it's working as efficiently as it can do for the type of work that you do. We can actually set up different custom controls for video as well as for stills. Now if you don't use the video mode when you're in stills, you can change the record button to be something a bit more useful. If you want to set up back button focus, for example, we can go in here to the shutter button and turn off autofocus from the shutter button. So then we already have back button focus set up because it's already on the AF on button there. Now, If we don't want to use the exposure lock button for exposure lock and we want to do something a little bit more useful, we can go in here and set that to AF as well. So now I have 2 back button focuses. But what I can do is go into this one, press info for detail set, and set up a specific operation for that back button. So if I know that one, I've got the camera set up for face tracking and doing all of that in Servo, I might want this button to switch to no tracking, for example. So I might want Servo 1, but AF area to be a spot, and disable the tracking. So suddenly I've got one with tracking on, like that, and then one with tracking. And then so you need to set what you want it to do, and then you need to set what you want it to. Do. Set it to override. I'm going to turn that off and override it, and actually I'm going to leave that because the camera's already on Servo. So that's all done, and now I just need to press menu to accept all of that. So now if I press the AF on button, I've got a tracking, and it will find the subject to track. Let me just get rid of some of this information. So if I press the AF on button, it will track my subject, but then if I press the exposure lock button, it will go to a single point, no tracking. So if I are trying to find a subject through branches, for example, it's a little bit easier to sort of pinpoint your subject without the tracking on sometimes. Or if you're trying to find a detail, so you're going for a logo on a outfit, this will help. So that's the way to do 2 back button focuses. But there's loads of other things you can do. I'm not going to go into this massively. It's well worth having a look through here. Customise dials allows you to set different settings to each of the dials, particularly this one at the bottom, which is the control ring on the lens. And that can be set to a whole slew of different things. When you see a down arrow, that's when it means it only affects it when you're half pressing the shutter button and actually actively metering. That way the setting can't be changed by accident. Below that is clear customized settings, which I'm going to do now because I've done quite a lot of customization. Custom menu 4, we have add cropping information. You can add information to the images if you have a specific aspect ratio you need the images to be in. You can adjust your audio compression. Default erase option, you can actually adjust what the erase button does when you hit erase. Does it erase just the raw images, for example, or just the JPEG, or just everything? Below that is release shutter without lens. So sometimes if you're using adapted lenses and it's something that we don't make, for example, or an older lens, and you want it to work, the camera isn't taking a picture, it's because of this setting, it doesn't recognize there's a lens there. So it thinks there's no lens and doesn't let you take a picture. Releasing shutter without lens will enable that. Retract lens or power off. Sometimes with some lenses the lens protrudes out as it focuses, and then to protect it, it brings it back in when you turn the camera off. If you're doing stop motion, for example, you don't want the camera to change anything because this will change your focus. So you can turn this off and it won't move the focus when turning the camera off. The next one just has clear all custom functions. And then the final one, the green menu here, is a My Menu tab. Now you can set up, if there's certain things in this whole menu walkthrough that I've shown you that you're going to use, but you're not going to use everything, you can set those to be in My Menu. So those are the things you're going to need access to quite regularly. You can add a new My Menu tab, which you can rename if you want, and you can select items. So you go through here and find the thing that you want to add. So let's say metering mode we're going to add. I don't know, let's say raw burst mode we're going to add, and then we'll press menu. We've got those on this My Menu tab. And if we go across one, we can actually say menu display from My Menu tab. So every time you hit menu from this screen, it'll go straight to My Menu first. I'm going to disable that because that will annoy me later. So that's pretty much it. I'm now going to switch over to video mode because the menu system is slightly different. Most of the settings are similar in video mode, but there are a few differences, particularly here. So we've got a few more options for our video settings. In stills mode, the video settings, the options that we had were just if you hit record when you're in stills mode. This time we have a lot more options. Now, they're actually very similar. So we have 4K at 50 or 25 and Full HD at 50 and 25. But we have the option of doing standard or light IPB. Now, IPB is a compression and it's down to how much more storage you want or how much footage you want to fit on your card and forego some level of quality by compressing the footage a little bit more. For most people, standard is what you want to be using. High frame rate mode allows the camera to go into a slow-mo mode. In this one, it will not be recording the audio, so just be aware of that. And we can actually go into movie record size and set 100 frames per second or 150 frames per second. So you can really slow the footage down and get some really cool effects. Movie cropping, we can actually crop into the image, and that allows you a little bit of flexibility in terms of the lenses that you choose, because it gives you different focal lengths with the same lens, essentially. Digital zoom we can enable only if we're in 25 frames per second Full HD, and what it does is it kind of crops into the images and it gives you digital zoom but maintains that resolution, which is quite clever. Sound recording, that's the levels as I showed you earlier. And then moving across, we have some more video settings. We have exposure compensation, video ISO speed settings, so we can limit the ISO range on the video side of things. HDR shooting, HDR PQ settings. By enabling this, you need to have a compatible monitor for it to really show through, but it looks great on the right kind of screens. Below that is HDR movie recording. This can only be done in 25 frames per second, and I believe this uses essentially 2 frames simultaneously at different exposures and overlays them, so you get even more dynamic range. Below that is auto lighting optimizer. Again, this takes into account the subject and makes sure that the light looks good on their face. Highlight tone priority, similar to the stills side, we're just making sure that the highlights don't blow out. And then high frequency anti-flicker shooting in video mode, so we can make sure that the flicker of the lights doesn't affect the video. And then shooting menu 3, we have the aperture increments, so we can actually enable smaller increments between the aperture stops. And below that we have auto slow shutter, which isn't enabled in this current mode, but basically allows the camera to prioritize having a higher shutter speed to give you smoother footage in low light. And then a lot of the rest of the stuff is very similar, so I'm not going to go into too much of the rest of it, but one that is useful here is Canon log settings. So if you want to go into Canon log, you can set C-Log 3. What this does is you'll notice that the image is quite grey now, and the reason for that is it's giving you the most dynamic range you can, and then you colour grade the footage afterwards. This is a slightly more advanced way of shooting with the camera if you're really into video, but it also allows you to match the camera very well to our cinema range as well, because they can also use C-Log 3. So View Assist will actually allow you to look at the footage as if it's already color graded, but it will actually be recording in C-Log 3. And you can set the color space below. Now, let me just disable that, and we can go and have a look at some other stuff. We can affect the clarity in the footage as well. And I think that's pretty much, oh yeah. So we can set a pre-recording time. So when you hit the record button, it will have recorded a certain number of seconds preceding the moment you hit the record button. Again, like that pre-shooting feature in the raw burst mode, but for video, and it can go up to 5 seconds, which is pretty crazy. We can set a time-lapse movie mode. I can't do that over Wi-Fi, HDMI, so I can't show you this one, but essentially allows you to set a certain amount of time and a certain interval between each picture it takes, and it will combine all of that information and make you a video in camera. Movie self timer, if you're shooting and you're actually doing a video of yourself, for example, like I am now, I can set the self timer for 2 seconds. That way I hit record and sit down, and you don't get that slightly awkward bit where I come and sit down. The number 7, we've got image stabilisation for video. So we've got digital IS for video there. There are some advanced features here like false colour set, which basically changes the colour of things based on whether it's clipping or just below clipping, or right down the bottom is underexposed, that kind of thing. And it'll look a little bit funky, but it will just help you ensure that every part of your image is correctly exposed. And we have Zebra, which is will give you a pattern of sort of zebra stripes based on the exposure. So very quickly, as an overlay, you can see that this area would probably be overexposed, and you can do it at different levels. So we have 70% kind of how high up into the exposure we want the zebra pattern to appear. Below this we have shooting info display, similar to what we had on the stills side of things, but you can actually set certain video information on the screen. So number 8, things that are different here. When you go into standby, it's going to drop into a low resolution mode so that the camera isn't building up any heat then. HDMI display, will it record to the card in the camera and the computer, or just on the computer? So down the bottom we have timecode. This is another advanced video feature, and it's to do with being able to set the cameras up using multiple cameras and sync them very, very easily. So the AF settings are a little bit different in the video side of things as well. So we have Servo AF, so we want the camera constantly focusing, which we probably do for tracking stuff. All of this is quite similar, but if we go across to Movie Servo AF speed on AF2, we can change how quickly the camera sort of changes the focus. So if you tap on one thing and then tap on another, do you want it to switch very quickly, or do you want a nice smooth pull focus effect? And often you kind of want that nice smooth look. And then just having a quick look through the rest, everything else looks pretty similar. That's it. That was everything there was in an EOS R8. If you have any questions, drop it in the comments. I will check back on this video every now and again, but I'm sure lots of other people in the community will be happy to help and give you some assistance and answers in there as well. Let me know in the comments also if there's any other cameras, Canon cameras that you want me to do one of these videos on. I'm always happy for suggestions. And thank you very much for watching. I hope this was helpful. Have a lovely weekend. Goodbye.